48-hour art check, 116.
Holy moly.
Yeah. And apparently it's getting high enough to where I can't count because I keep messing it up, so. Like when you're a little kid and you're so excited that you can count to 100 that you want to show everyone and then you don't know what happens after that. I feel like that's what I've reached.
I love it. Squatchy's in the chats. He said good evening. Good
Hey,
evening.
what's up, man?
All right.
Okay, should we and we've got Scott here as well.
Hey everyone.
So if you guys in the chats want to share this, we're going to go a little long tonight, and 3 people is always good. So, all right, should we jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, Josh, why don't you start?
Okay. So, what are? Oh my goodness, I have the wrong things pulled up. Hang on. Okay. So I finished penciling 2 panels for the Dragon comic for the quarterly story, or for the 100 Days of Making Comics anthology number 2, and then I have penciled the first panel, the first section of quarterly stories. So tonight, I actually just finished penciling panel 3 for the Dragon comic, and then I'm hoping to catch up and get a little bit of movement on panel 2 for quarterly stories. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at so far.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. How about you, Scott? What have you gotten done?
Let's see. From the little thumbnail thing there, I just uploaded a new video recapping my 9th week of 100 Days of Making Comics. So I filmed that, edited that, and did all that stuff. I've been working on Kickstarter graphics and Kickstarter rewards and things like that. Just a ton of Kickstarter stuff because I wanted to kind of launch the beginning of this month. And then I was like, well, maybe I can wait till the middle. And then something kind of came up that I'm looking at, maybe a conference that I may be wanting to go to. So I'm like, okay, I've got to get this Kickstarter thing done because I want it to wrap up before I go to this conference, assuming that I go. So I've been going crazy doing Kickstarter stuff. So hopefully I will be able to launch next week.
Cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's exciting. So I pushed the wrong button. There we go. Yeah, so I have just been inking. So the full page is on the left, and then some detail stuff is on the right. I changed up techniques to an older technique that I kind of abandoned because the brush was faster, but I can't get the same detail with the brush. So I did most of this in brush, and then I went back to like technical pens, like a micron for some of the detail. As I rip off Arthur Adams with how he does scales and stuff. but yeah, so that's kind of, oh, you have that? Yeah, there you go.
I've got my Arthur Adams book right here. I'm working on a project that I want to try to incorporate some of his kind of style.
Yeah, I have he's got these prints in this giant, what is it called? Kung Fu Bible something or other. I got this from, the giant size Kung Fu Bible stories.
Oh, I gotta check that out.
Yeah, I don't know where you could get it. I bought it from Ryan Otley. It's like it's huge. But
is it Art Adams or Ryan Otley or both?
It is. It's Bruce Timm, Adam Warren, Tom Scully, Ryan Otley, Eric Larson.
Okay, so it's like an anthology then?
Yeah, and he's got.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so he's got these big giant. Oh, there we go. He's got these big giant kind of prints in it.
Oh.
Yeah, and so it's like the Space Girl, and then he's got 3 prints, but they're like, how big is this? Yeah, not quite 11 by 17. I think it's probably 11 by 14, but it's huge for a book, and so anyway, makes for really nice. Just being like, how did he do that? Because that guy gets so much grayscale out of not actually using grays. It's crazy.
And he uses so many different techniques, and his cross hatching is just crazy. I mean, it shouldn't work, but it does. You know.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's my sorry attempt, and I thought it's turning out okay. That second from the bottom panel didn't turn out anything remotely close to like what I want. It's supposed to be this clamshell monster that causes it's a shape shifting monster called a Shen that is a clamshell that can shapeshift into a dragon and causes people to hallucinate. And so I was going for like the hallucination style, and I feel like she just kind of gets lost in the noise. So I think when I add some like gray tones, I'll just gray that whole panel out and then leave her like bright white and dark black, and I think that'll help like push her forward.
Got it. Are you going to be adding gray tones to the whole thing?
I might do just a touch of gray to a little bit of it, but that panel, like the intention is for it to stand out and look super weird. So even if I don't add anything to the rest of it, then it'll still work. But I might just add some like 20% grays just to kind of round out some of the stuff that I wanted to touch up on. I'll play with it in the computer and kind of see.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been considering that depending on time frames.
Yeah.
For when I get it, doing just like a one tone, you know, like. But once again, I also think there's a beauty to just straight black and white. So it's like this thing I've been kind of tenuous about, and I'm not sure.
Yeah.
What about you, Scott? Are you thinking about toning yours, or are you?
I've thought about it, but as far as right now, I think because Young and the Dead is toned, and if I do tone this, I want it to be a little more of kind of a wash. Like, I don't know if I would do it traditionally or digitally, but I don't know. I mean, I kind of want it to look different than Young and the Dead, and since Young and the Dead has some gray tones, I might not. But right now, I'm leaning towards just straight black and white, but that could change. I may decide. I think it would look good in tone. I always, I do like that, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And I might. I was considering doing a wash, like just scanning the blacks and printing them out and trying some washes on the printout. Because then I can keep it totally traditional, but not like ruin the pages since I have no idea what I'm doing with washes.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Although you'd need the ink to be not bleeding.
Yeah,
so
right.
Probably print through. I'm trying to think of what you'd do to kind of avoid the bleed. Maybe even just light box your washes.
Yeah, that would be interesting. That's a good idea.
Like on a different sheet or something.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I'm a sucker for just like one tone shading, where it's like, like a gig poster or something like that, where you're not using any halftones or anything like that. It's just one shade of like light gray, or actually ideally like one shade of color. But
yeah,
I don't know. We'll see what time allots for all of us.
Right.
On these things, Cool. So should we get into challenges?
Yeah. So did we start with you, Josh?
Sure.
Yeah. So what challenges have you had?
So I just got over being sick and hit the workout today, which I think was helpful. Because unfortunately, it just keeps delaying that schedule, which I'm like, I don't want another week and a half of just waiting to, So that was good, but yeah, the challenge of just being sick and not 100% there, and then just being really overwhelmed. Like outside of here, it's kind of chaotic. We're doing interviews at my job. We're doing for which is a good thing because it means our department's expanding. But it's just that's a lot of extra work on top of the work that I regularly do in a day, and then just busy stuff. Like there's some family stuff that's come up that's not new stuff. It's just kind of older stuff. And so just kind of, once again, just balance and just trying to find time has been difficult. So like, even speaking of this, like a perfect example is like one thing I'm going to do tonight, hell or high water, is edit one podcast at least, which isn't that complicated. We've kind of worked it out to where it's a fairly streamlined process, but it's still like one of those things I've just pushed and pushed and pushed. and now there's this big collection of ones to do. So I figure at least carving away at it, getting one or two knocked out tonight would be good. Yeah.
And along those lines, I've got an ask for the audience. If anybody is interested in participating, kind of on a pro bono level, it's a lot. It's been a lot for Josh and I to do that, and we keep getting behind. But if you're interested in jumping in and just like taking these and ripping them and getting them ready for the podcast, it takes about maybe 10, 15 minutes per episode, 20 minutes to like figure it out. But it's not a ton. Anyway, if anybody's interested, I can kind of walk you through our process, and that would make it super awesome. If not, we'll keep doing it. But if
any aspiring audio engineers, we'll give you credit and stuff like that as well. So
yeah, if you want to plug at the end, one of the things that Josh has got on his plate is to mix a kind of an end cap to the podcast, and we would include whoever wanted to help. So anyway, so there's that. So how about you, Scott? What challenges have you had?
My biggest challenge is just coming off a vacation. And if anyone didn't know, the last Artcasters, which was on Josh's channel, all three of us were on there, Josh and I together in person at his house. So thanks for letting me crash at your place and everything, Josh. That was awesome. So, awesome vacation, but, now I got to come back and get back into everything. So just trying to make that transition and catch up on all this other stuff. But I don't know. I mean, it's sometimes it's nice to kind of get that recharge. So I don't know how much of a challenge it really was. I was kind of as much fun as I had on the vacation. I was anxious to kind of get back to work and get back into things. So I kind of dived headfirst into it. And I'm surprised with the amount of progress I've made just getting stuff ready for this Kickstarter, because I was kind of worried having to push everything back, but it's starting to come together now. So
yeah. And I think that's a good example of like, challenges don't always have to be like negative and hard. They just, it was a time consuming thing. It was good, but it still cuts into time. So, for me, I don't know. The main thing is I had planned on getting a ton done on Saturday, and ended up having to spend about 8.5 hours working on my fish tank. And those things, like when it pops up, it's kind of an emergency, because like I didn't pay this for them, but because I've grown them so large, I've got, a few $1,000s worth of fish in there. And so like probably not that much, but a few $100s at least. Cause I've got fish that are like, over 12 inches, and some of them are like 18 inches. And so when something goes wrong, I have to fix it right away. And so that took most of my Saturday cause I've got like a 125 gallon tank. And I don't have to do much with it most of the time, but that was kind of a big hit, because that was kind of like my time to do stuff. And so I kind of pushed it in the evening. But anyway, I probably could have knocked this page out had I not had to do that. And I also didn't get to the video that I've been wanting to do for a few days and I keep talking about. And but I want to do this kind of recap video of everybody's sticker stint. And I'm really excited about it, but I just haven't. That kind of sapped my energy and took the wind out of my sails, so I didn't get around to that. But I got some progress on the page, but I kind of missed out on everything else. So Josh, how about? Oh, sorry, go ahead. I was gonna say plans.
I was actually just gonna cap on that. It sounds like all of us had a little bit of pretty standard kind of challenges.
Yeah.
Although the fish tank thing, man, you got to think twice before you get fish.
Yeah, I mean,
a lot to maintain. Just cleaning a small fish tank is a lot of work, but like that size of fish tank, it blows my mind.
Yeah, I mean, generally the bigger they are, the easier they are to maintain. Because if something goes wrong in a 10-gallon tank, it goes wrong immediately. But if something goes wrong in a 125-gallon tank, like there's so much more volume of water that it can kind of like right itself most of the time. And I've got like a good balance in there. So this is really like the first time. It's the first time in about 4 months that I've had to do anything to it. It's pretty self-sustaining most of the time. So Anyway.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so my plans are to let me see. Sorry. So my plans are to try to finish I'd say like 2 more panels of the Dragon comic, and then I'd like to finish at least 2 panels for Quarterly Stories, the next page. And it's actually a pretty fun page because I'm drawing like old superheroes that I invented as a kid at the bottom of it. So I think it'll be a lot of fun when I get to that part. So I'm just kind of hoping to get to that part, at least be started on that section of it, by the next time we meet. And then the other thing is I really want to edit at least 2 podcasts by then too. Because I do think the podcast element of this is great, but I feel like it does have to be a little consistent for us to like really get any ground on that gained. And so, for anybody who's subscribed and stuff like that, like, thank you for your patience and understanding on that.
And a new episode went up today, and another one will go up on Thursday. So
perfect.
Yeah. How about you, Scott? What kind of plans do you have for the next couple of days?
The main thing is just Kickstarter, getting all that stuff ready. That's going to take up most of my time. I do right now when I'm working on. I can't really show it right now, but I'm also working on a tour design for a pretty popular podcast. I gotta do that too. I gotta get caught up on that because it's I'm not worried about deadline, but I'm kind of following behind, partially because of me, partially because it took a while to get the down payment, but now I got to kind of catch up. So
cool.
That brings up a really good topic, which we should touch on, which is getting that down payment. That's a really good. That's one of those things I didn't pay attention to as a new designer, and then later learned the hard way. That's how you kind of have to do things.
I feel like everybody, no matter how much they think they believe that, has to get burned by that before they start doing it.
Yeah,
it's a weird thing, but yeah.
We should talk about contracts at some point because it's a weird thing. I got another job that I've got pretty much an ironclad contract, but this other job it was a logo design project, and they just all of a sudden they decide, it sounds like they're kind of deciding they want to do something different, but I've already done pretty much the whole thing. And it states that in the contract that they still have to pay me if, there's certain stages if they don't, if they cancel it because of certain reasons, even if they decide they don't like it, which is kind of weird because I've got emails from them saying, oh, these are awesome and everything, but people can change their mind and everything. So you gotta protect yourself because, and even with that, even with the contract, I still may never get paid. Yeah. I mean, I could go to court, but is it worth going to court? So
right.
Yeah, I definitely think that's something worth bringing up. All right. So what are your plans, Cory? Wait, did we get you? I don't think we got you.
No, not yet. So you can see I've got 2.5 more panels and some spot blacks to do on this page. And one of those panels with the kappas, those kind of Koopa Troopa looking dudes, that's going to be a lot of wood grain. That takes some time. And then the other is a lot of tentacle work where they're getting attacked by a kraken. And that is a little bit of time as well because I'm going to do more like texture heavy stuff. And so I think I'll keep it there. And then if the planets align themselves and somehow magically I'm able to do that video, I'm going to try to do that video too because I want to do that while it's still relevant. Those are kind of my plans.
Nice. Cool. All right. So let's try to pull ourselves into this topic. What was the topic again?
Okay. So I think contracts might be really interesting to talk about, but we had also talked about kind of the balance between like self-promotion and being a normal human being.
Nice. Which one's tickling your guys' fancy right now?
I could do either. I could do either,
Yeah.
but I like contracts.
We can do contracts. Yeah, I mean, I like both those topics. We'll definitely, if we don't do the promotion one, we'll definitely do that one later. Hopefully, it's on one that I'm on.
Yeah,
but no, yeah.
No, we can save it for you for sure.
Sweet. So let's dip into it. So you want to introduce it, Cory?
Yeah.
All right.
So today's topic is contracts and how to set up a good working relationship with your clients. So before we started this podcast, Scott was talking about some things, and then Josh and I kind of said, "Oh yeah, we've kind of done a similar thing." And so I don't know exactly where we want to start off, but I feel like there are kind of some standards that most independent contractors, whether you're in illustration or design or video or writing or whatever, that in the creative field, where there's some things that you should always do. And everyone always tells people that are just starting out these things. And I believe that beginners, and recent graduates and stuff believe that they should do those things. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think anybody actually does those things until they get burned. And I think I know why. I had this experience where I was working for this guy, and nice enough guy, but it was a good lesson in how not to run a business. And I remember being so frustrated with specific behaviors that he did. And then I struck out on my own. And I remember when it came down to crunch time, I almost made the same type of decisions that he made. And all of a sudden it dawned on me like, oh, there's like actual reasons to to make these decisions. And it was an interesting thing. It wasn't the road that I should go down, but I began to understand why, if you give into that fear and you give into that emotion, you give into that eagerness, you can abandon some of your rules. And so if this serves as a warning, that would be great, because, and if not, maybe you've been burned, but you don't know what to do about it. I just thought it would be interesting to kind of go through some of those basic rules. And the first one is, have a contract. So I'm curious, what are some of the main things in your guys' contracts that you use for freelance work?
So I want to just kind of start this out by saying, like a lot of my peers and people I've met in illustration, I didn't have a contract at first,
right?
And that suited me very fine for freelance work when the clients paid. It became really problematic when I had a client who had agreed to hire me for a job, and then just basically I got stuck in revision limbo, which is anybody who's familiar with freelance knows what that is. It's like basically when you're on a feedback loop of revisions, and you start realizing that the client that hired you thinks that like the whatever flat amount that you guys agreed to is basically makes you their artist until the job is perfect to their satisfaction, even if you've fulfilled the brief multiple times. And so when you find yourself in a situation like that, you very quickly, at least I very quickly realized that like all my friends and people I knew who had been at this for a long time, who had kind of been like, you want to have a contract, you want to have revision limits in that contract. They weren't insane. Like, right. They were pretty legitimate. And so I would say that I do want to preface this with there are also different working relationships with different companies. Yeah. So a lot of this is going to be having to do with more of like your standard client, but this won't apply to like how you would work a contract with, say, like working for a giant corporation or a big company that deals with freelancers on a pretty continual basis. Because in a lot of those cases, they provide the contract and it'll have a lot of that specified. So like perfect example is like Scholastic. You're not really going to argue rates with Scholastic unless you're a heavy enough hitter to argue rates. Like if you're if you're John Klassen or like a massive children's book artist and they're trying to hire you, then maybe you have a place at the table to negotiate. But if you're like a startup or kind of an unheard of, and Scholastic's offering you like, hey, we need you to do like, what's a good intro thing they usually hire people for? Like Highlights Magazine. If they're like, hey, we need this like spot illustration for Highlights Magazine. Here's our rate. Here's what we offer. Here's when we need it. And here's the size and resolution. Can you do that? At that point, you usually would just say yes or no.
Yeah.
Because they're not really in a negotiating point of view, because like, once again, they're such a big publisher with so many large contacts that they literally don't need you. And they work with multiple illustrators. So what they're offering you is pretty much what they offer every illustrator. Save, like I said, the few rock stars out there. It's very similar with like magazines too, just as a preface. Magazines and editorial, usually like they pay so much per spread, so much per spot, so much per single illustration, and it's not super up for negotiation. It's pretty much just a flat rate, and if you can't make it, great, they'll find someone else. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's really important to keep in mind with like things like weeklies, like which are notoriously terrible in pay, but they actually do offer a slight bit of exposure, which is usually a dangling carrot that doesn't end well at all. But with a weekly, you know, most artists doing weekly illustrations like LA Weekly. I'm forgetting what the one in Portland was called, but I did stuff for them a long time ago. And usually that's like really tight turnarounds on a very tiny budget.
Yeah.
But so those things aside, in general, which you need to specify a few things in contracts. And as we're getting into this, I think all of us would recommend that you get the Graphic Artists Guild Pricing and Ethical Guidelines book, because it just offers templates for a lot of great contracts that are just blank. They're like blank slate contracts. Their pricing is a little
high, a lot high. And even for like, I go with like, I've got one that's probably like, I don't know how many years, 10 years old or more, and it's still, you know, it's still really high. Not that, yeah.
Their sample size for their polling is very specific. You know what I mean? Like, they're not polling everyone. They're polling they're polling like the elite. You know, the New people, and the people that can afford to, you know, pay the dues to be a member of the Illustration Society and stuff like that.
It is a good negotiating, like if you can present that and say, if you get somebody that says, well, that sounds kind of expensive, you know, then you could say, well, here's what the standards say, even though, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's a good framework to start with. But I mean, I think one thing I'd keep in mind, this was a couple years back. I think it's still on their site. So if you guys search around, you might be able to find it. But I did a talk actually about pricing to the Society of Illustrators in LA. And I was like up there with one of the main editors of the Graphic Artists Guild book. Yeah. And I mentioned the inflated pricing, and she laughed and was like, he's right. and it was like, it was hilarious. But I think another thing that happens is like, it's sort of like they ask, you know, a web designer like what they're charging. And then the web designer says an inflated rate. And then the next guy who's pulled sees the web designer, what they're saying. And they're like, well, I got to say, it's like, you know, so it's one of those things of, I definitely don't know if it's all that honest, because I've talked with some pretty heavy hitting designers and artists, and those rates just don't always happen. I mean, ideally in a world that's kind of perfect, that would be what you'd see. But I would guess even with the people they're polling, the rates are pretty exaggerated. So keep that in mind. But it's a good framework for writing contracts.
There's a lot more. Go ahead, Cory.
I was going to say on the local level, because they have, you can go in there and there's tables, and it'll give you like geographical reach and business size and things like that. And on the local level, I've found that they are, their range is accurate on the graphic design side and helpful on the illustration side, because for example, I didn't know what to charge for this one job, and it was one illustration, but it was actually 6 illustrations, because they wanted they wanted me to design 4 different characters and a background, and then some other elements, and some vehicles and things like that, and then illustrate it so that it was all one giant thing, but then also so that it could be broken up into different pieces, and so they were going to use it. They're gonna splinter it and use it, as you should. And I had no idea what to charge for that, and so I actually went there, and I just looked it up, and I was like, yeah, that seems reasonable, and I got like not quite the lower end of that range that they show, but like a few steps above the lower end of the range, and I just showed them the book, and I said, hey, because we're doing this, and then this, and it was really good because it seems like a lot for one drawing.
Yeah.
But it actually took me several months to do, and a lot of it was because of the back and forth with the client, but a lot of it was just because it was really complicated drawing. And so like kind of what we've already said, like using it not necessarily as like a strong arm in negotiation, but just like sometimes, especially on a local level, you will be hired by somebody and neither of you knows what to charge. And it's not that there are some unscrupulous business people out there that are trying to bleed everybody dry, and frankly, they're going to go out of business or continue to run through the dross that is willing to deal with them. But not everybody is out to get you, and some people just don't know. And some people are like, well, I think this logo should cost $50, and you're like, well, let's talk about what it takes to make a logo. But part of that discussion can be like what Scott was saying, here's some industry standard rates, and I'm here. This is what I charge because of where we live and your reach and whatnot. So it's not, I know that you're not like a internationally recognized business or whatever. But my time is worth something. And oftentimes just seeing like they don't want to pay too much, but they don't want to pay less than you're worth. And sometimes there's a standard that it just kind of helps rather than say, I don't know, he just said this number and I don't know if that's high or low because I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah. You can both look at this thing and say, let's discuss this table here and kind of decide together where we think we are.
Yeah. And so like one of the things that I would say just to early designers is while you look at those rates and realize they're inflated, they're not that inflated.
Right.
And that's a good thing to realize too, because if you're underbidding, you're really setting your own business up for failure.
Yeah.
So a perfect example is like, I mean, this is a couple years back, but like the going rate, like the very bottom rung rate for a t-shirt design was about like $250, just flat rate.
Right.
That's for like a startup that had like no money whatsoever. That's like the absolute lowest you should charge. There are people who are doing those for like $20, like $30. They're going on Fiverr and offering designs like that for cheap. So what those people aren't realizing is like, now keep in mind, that's not like what I would charge most people for design. I'd probably charge a lot more.
Right.
But that's the base, like absolute lowest I can think of for like a t-shirt design. And what you got to realize is like, if a guy like me is doing t-shirt designs for like, let's just say like more of a standard for me, which is like 500. So if I'm doing my t-shirt designs for 500 a piece, I'm going to do 2 t-shirt designs, and I've made what you would make charging like $50 a shirt design. I've just basically, I'm trying to do the math on that. So I've made like 20 times as much as you, with less effort and with probably more skill, because I've been paid the adequate amount to make it the best possible design that I can.
Yeah.
And so while I'm doing it, I'm not worrying about like the lights going out because I'm not paying my electric bill, or my day job, conflicting with it, because it's allowing enough buffer to kind of get that done well. And so like when you're starting to negotiate rates, it's good to ask around and find out what industry standard is, and try not to like base it on all the friends you have. Like a perfect example of this that I see going the wrong way is like what I see people charge for like fan art and for like commissions.
I was going to bring up commissions. Oh my gosh. Go ahead.
So we've talked about this before, and I'm not going to trash anybody who's charging, a low amount for a commission because, hey, I've paid friends like what I think is a steal to get like a decent commission.
Yeah.
And as an art director, like hell, if you're going to charge that, I'll take advantage of it. But the point being, like, some of the rates I've seen for commissions, like if you did like, 2,000 commissions, you wouldn't be able to pay like a month of rent or a month of your mortgage.
Right.
And to me, like when it starts getting so low that if you do the math, like you'd end up kind of being better off spending that time doing fast food. I always recommend this for people starting out, like when coming up with that rate, to just do fast food and then draw what you want and like take away the stress and the specialization of doing the art and just do the fast food to make the extra money because you're going to make a lot more.
Yeah. And it kind of depends on the stage of life you're in. I mean, there are times in my life, like in college and whatever, where $20 would have made or break, make or break. I don't know. Anyway, past tense of make or break. My month, right? Where, if I could get a couple for $20, then that would have been great. But like nowadays, I look at some people that are charging 10, 20, $35 for a commission, and the work that they're doing is incredible. And I think one of two things: either they are insanely fast and way better than I am, which is likely in a lot of situations, or they are massively undercharging. And that's fine. And I'm not one of those guys that's like, you're ruining the industry or whatever. But I just can't compete and participate in that world with the expectations and prices where they are, cause if you haven't drawn Batman, for DC, then kind of there's this expectation in the commission world where your commissions are insanely low. And I'm like, well, I'll just be over here drawing my own book or whatever, because it's going to take me just as long to do that commission as it would to do half a page in a comic or something. And and so it's kind of an interesting thing. Pricing is kind of an interesting thing.
I do feel like we're maybe getting lost in the weeds of pricing, but I think that's at least a valuable point to bring up at the beginning is like, you want to work out what you're going to price. You want to include, regardless, whatever agreement you make with a client or a potential client, make sure it's in writing, in an email. Basically, like anything said is wind. And legally, that's the case too, where it's just kind of hearsay. So it's like, hey, so-and-so agreed to mow my lawn. Like legally, it's considered a verbal contract, but it's really hard to prove a verbal contract.
And by the time you have to prove that, the relationship is shot.
Yeah.
And
agreed.
So oftentimes I have found that people are willing to talk about a lot of things, but they will think about the decision they're making before they sign a piece of paper. We've kind of been trained in our society to kind of shoot from the hip verbally, but when it comes down to signing a piece of paper, you take pause. And so what I find is that here's something I see a lot of beginners do, a lot of students. They're afraid of their contract and they try to sneak it by the client rather than use it as a tool, almost as a visual aid to explain the process. And so the contract that I use is the Illustrator's Agreement in the Pricing and Ethical Guidelines book for the Graphic Artists Guild, with some stuff that I've modified and added in. And I use that almost as a PowerPoint. I just go point by point and I explain what each thing means and why that is valuable to the client. And so I say, hey, listen, have you ever had a situation where you've had project creep, and, one of your customers, continues to want more value without paying you anything? And I said, you don't feel good about that person, right? And I feel great about you right now. I want to continue to feel great about you. And I want this to be a long relationship where you get the value that you're paying for. And part of that is going to be this revision clause that I have here. And all this really does is just say that we both agree that in this contract that you are paying for up to 3 revisions per milestone. And then once we cross a milestone, going back over that milestone will be a change order where I'll tell you how much it costs. And so each time I just explain, and I'll explain the range as well. I'll say, I'm gonna give you an ABC bid, right? I'm gonna give you kind of a low ball bid, mid of the range bid, and then kind of a pie in the sky bid. And I said the main difference between those is the amount of time that I can spend in each of these stages. And so if you want a really super creative idea, I would go with the C. I'd go with the high bid, because that allows me the creative freedom to be able to explore this. Whereas, if you go for the lowball bid, I'm going to get you the best I can within a specific time frame. But as as a business owner, time is money. And so there's a limit to that. And using the contract to teach them your process actually makes it so that you're not negotiating on opposite sides of the table as much as you are like learning together. And I've had, ever since I've started doing that, I've had just great experiences with this process, because they feel like they feel more educated about it. And even the ones where I'm pricing myself out of their budget appreciate it. And very rarely do I get somebody who's like, gets all huffy and puffy. Sometimes they will even apologize for not being able to afford my rates. And I'll say, hey, that's fine. I don't mind at all, and I will even help hook them up with, maybe a student who's got lower rates than I do because they're still learning, or I can say, we can still figure out some ways to do this project and save you some money if we did X, Y, or Z, or didn't do this or did that. And then it becomes you and your client sitting together on the same side of the table solving a business problem, rather than sitting on opposite sides of the table in this big long conference room, staring each other down, sliding pieces of paper back and forth, with numbers on them and whatever. All of that kind of like high drama TV stuff is really detrimental to 2 people sitting down and discussing the value of this contract to both parties.
Yeah, I guess in the chats, people are mentioning that the feed's been kind of wonking out, but from what I hear, it sounds like it's kind of a YouTube issue. So I think our feed is okay.
Okay.
And from what everybody's been saying in the chats, like if you just kind of restart it and refresh it, it should kind of assist. But we'll just kind of power through and hopefully you guys can watch it in the retake.
I have a local recording, so if the live one is shot, I'll upload the local one.
Awesome. So capping on to what you were saying, I think there's a really important lesson from that too, which is like a constant early mistake when you're drafting a contract. Let's say it's like an early job, is to try to use legalese. And actually that's a big error. Generally you want to keep your contract as succinct and as straightforward as possible, because basically the way that contract law works is the more obscure and kind of conniving the contract seems, actually the more problematic it's going to be in that relationship with your client, because people aren't idiots, and if they're very smart business people, they're not going to just sign anything.
Right.
Since running my own business, I've learned to read every single I and T in a contract before I sign it, because for all you could be signing something that, like I said, is like a revision trap, where it's like the person owns you for a flat rate, and that's a really bad situation to end up in. Another thing to keep in mind is you need to be fair with your contracts, so you yourself have to hold yourself to certain things.
Yep.
One of the things that I specify in my contract that I think most illustrators do is that the original brief of the job has to be fulfilled. So this puts the onus on me, as well as you, if you're the illustrator, to make sure you're getting as clear of a brief as possible. If there's any ambiguity in writing, get clarification on everything, because that way you're sure to get the job done as best as you can to fulfill the brief. If you are hired to draw 10 people and you turn in a drawing of 9 people and it's beautiful, it's still not a drawing of 10 people.
Yeah.
And so that's problematic, not on the client's end. They shouldn't have to pay out the nose for that revision, because that's just you being careless with a brief.
Yeah.
And so that's something to keep in mind, and also a really good way to sell the contract, and not in a dishonest way, in the best way, which is just selling it for what it is. It protects the client from getting ripped off from some, illustrator who's going to basically just send them a happy face and say, the job's done, you owe me money.
Right.
And it's also to protect you as the illustrator from a client who hires you to draw a football field and then goes, oh, actually, I wanted a baseball field. And you're like, but the original brief. So the contract can kind of protect that. So I would say the specifics to get into in the contract are like, what's your limit on revisions? Does generally I would recommend doing flat rate. That's why I kind of got into pricing. I don't tend to like doing hourly unless it's consistent work. So if it's a client who's going to come back a lot, they have a high volume of work.
Yeah.
Perfect example of that would be like, I did these books for this publisher, Weldon Owen, that are like show me how books. And they were all like diagrammatical illustrations. And there were hundreds and hundreds of these things. And it was so steady and consistent that I didn't mind working for an hourly rate with that client.
Yeah.
Because it was steady and consistent, and they were really honest in their accounting, and I was honest in my accounting. So it ended up being a very valuable relationship in that way. But I would say, like, for a one-off client, doing a flat rate, never really state your hourly. If you're working in-house, generally you're going to be hourly. So that's another, exception to the rule. But
another quick, I just want to interject the only time that really I have hourly, well, I use an hourly rate to sort of determine what that flat rate will be.
Right.
But
yes.
For revisions after the fact, like if they go over what is stated,
yes.
then there's an hourly charge for that.
Yeah. And that actually works as an incentive. Like Cory was mentioning earlier, when people see something in writing, it makes it a little more serious. So one thing you'll notice about people when they're hiring an artist, and this is something you get better and better at, like the more seasoned you get as a freelancer or as a professional artist, you'll notice these telltale signs that the client hasn't really thought it out fully before they've hired you.
Yeah.
And a lot of that will be revealed through specific questions that come up, like when they're unclear. And the big key is a lack of clarity. So like this age-old rule of like not assuming really applies to doing an effective job as a visual communicator. You need to know clearly everything about the job, like down to like how they're planning on printing it, and what process they're planning on using to print it. Because if they're hiring you to do like a kid's book, that's great. But is it an ebook? Like what size is the book? Are there specific parameters for like how far in the gutter the illustrations can go? Like,
right.
Is there a certain safe area with the printing company you're using? Because that varies. I mean, generally it's about 1/4 of an inch for a safe area, but it could be, maybe they're a better printer and it's actually like 1/8 of an inch. And those are things you need to know, like what's their bleed? Because most printers, it's 0.125 all around, but then some printers like they need 1/4 because their registration's worse, and some
right.
sizes need more bleed. So it's like better to get specifics about that. And let's say you just make an assumption that it's a standard printer and you just give it 1/8 of an inch bleed, and then you're told actually this was for an ebook. Like, what I'm saying is like there's so many problems that can come up from not getting specifics from a client, and those do not rest solely on the client. It's akin to somebody coming in or hiring like a plumber. Hey, something's wrong with my pipes. And you don't ask any questions, or somebody going into a car mechanic and like, you're saying my car's been making these weird noises. You'll notice the mechanic usually has to ask a lot of questions. Like when you were driving, did it kick in? Was it when you started the car that it made that noise? Like, has it been continuing? Like, those kind of questions are like diagnosing the problem. And that's pretty much what you're doing as a graphic designer, is figuring out the problem and then solving it.
Yeah.
And so that's something to keep in mind. But what Scott just brought up about having an hourly, yeah, definitely have an hourly in your contract for revisions. And also understand that revisions happen. So what I usually do, which Scott touched on, is I'll take like my hourly rate. I'll kind of roughly figure out like how long it's going to take me. If it's 8 hours or something, I want to include a lunch break and 2 10s, so I'm like legally working in my own brain. And then I'm just going to kind of equate whatever amount of time times whatever my hourly rate is. Then what I tend to do is also calculate 2 revisions, and generally minor revisions. And I'll include that in the contract, and I'll clarify what a minor revision is versus a major revision. And so my contract will basically talk about the hourly rate for revisions. It'll also talk about the cost of like a complete brief change, meaning like it usually will just specify like if the brief is completely changed, we have to renegotiate and come up with a new job because it's a different job at that point. Right. So like I said, that covers the whole football field versus baseball field thing, which happens. People change their minds. The nice thing about including that hourly in your contract and not sneaking it in there, just being clear about it from the get-go. Because if you sneak, that's where people get upset. Right. They feel like you're trying to pull a fast one. You generally want to be transparent and just be like, hey, and like any revisions past this like are billed at this much per hour. And it's usually an amount because they're not usually seeing the hourly rate. If you're a smart designer, they're going to think it's really inflated. And it's not. But what it does do is put the fear of God in that person, because they start thinking and calculating in their head like all of that money that could potentially lead to if they're unclear. Right. And you'll bet that their brief is 20 times clearer. Another thing, and then I want to give it to
before you move on, I want to talk to one point on that. There are 2 things that I suggest that I do when you're explaining that part to the client, when you're talking about revisions and change orders. And there's a difference between revisions and change orders. Revisions are built into the contract. A change order is something that is outside of the contract, which can come as a revision, or it can come as what Josh was talking about, where like they just change it from a football field to a baseball field, like something major in the creative brief changes. They're moving the goalposts or whatever. Too many sports analogies, but either way, what I do when I'm explaining that is I couch it in a positive way, and I say I want to make sure that you get exactly what you want, and so we've got a limited number of revisions, and if you want to do more revisions than that, that is perfectly fine. And what'll happen is you give me those revisions, and I will warn you, how many revisions you've got left within the contract. And if you would like to exceed that number, that's cool. I don't mind that at all. Before I do any work, I will sit down, look at that revision, and give you an estimate of how much that change order will cost. And then I won't do any work until you tell me go. And I've had both situations where somebody's like, oh, I need to change this. I need to change this. I need to change this. And on the second time, I'm like, sounds good. Do you want me to do anything else while you're changing this? Because this will be your second revision. And then they get their third revision. They come back to me again. I just need to make this one little tweak. And I say, yeah, that's awesome. I'd love to do that. We're out of revisions in the contract. So let me get back to you in a little bit and tell you how much that change order will be. It probably won't be a lot, but let me just give you kind of how much that would be for this. And they'll say, oh, okay, great. And then I come back to them, and sometimes they go, you know what? I'm being nitpicky at this point. I like it. Let's just move on. I don't want to do the change order. But other times they go, I've actually talked to my board, and this is a significant sticking point that we have agreed that we're willing to pay for. And so why don't you bill us for that change order and then go ahead and do it? And I've had both.
Sometimes. Oh, sorry.
I was just saying I've had both of those responses, and I'd say 90% of the time, it was a very positive experience. Nobody was really upset because I managed the expectations up front and maintained those expectations throughout. Sorry, go ahead, 100%. Scott.
I was going to say one of the things that I do, because I'll lay out the number of revisions and everything, and I'll usually go a little under what I'm willing to give as far as for what I'm being paid for the act that assuming everything doesn't go over. Because sometimes if I get to the point where if I've offered like 3 revisions and these are smaller, if it's a major revision, it's different. But if it's a smaller revision, sometimes, I'll let them know, well, we're kind of at the end of revisions, but, I will do this for you. And they feel like they're getting something extra out of it, which is always good for them. But the main thing for me is I just don't want people to go crazy. I don't mind doing maybe a couple extra smaller revisions. But if you don't have anything in that contract, I mean, literally they can change more and more and keep going forever. So I don't mind maybe doing a couple extra, but and again, it depends on the size of revision. If it's a huge revision, then I'll be like, yeah, this is going to cause extra, but that's kind of at my discretion. Like if I want to do a couple changes, a lot of times I don't mind doing that.
Well, and you're pointing out a really good thing, which is you always want your customer to leave happy. And I mean, that's a really good just kind of method of running any business. And everybody appreciates like when people aren't such sticklers for like following the letter of the law that they can't kind of see the humanity in the person they're working with. Yeah. So like that's something to keep in mind. Like this contract is not like it's not a you versus them thing. It's a you working with other people thing. And it does protect you legally as well. But it also assures the client that they're going to get what they want. It assures you that you're going to get paid for the job and for the time you've put in. And it also assures that that basically like that revision can be up to you as a favor to the client. Or like I said, in the case where it's just exceeding human expectations, which I think most illustrators had happen, which is why that's always included in a contract. Then at that point you have some kind of backing to be like, look, anything beyond this and we're going to have to charge, I apologize. I wish this were kind of hitting it for you, but at the same time, we've fulfilled the brief is changing, we need to negotiate a new contract. Or you can say, we've fulfilled the revisions. And at this point we've changed the color 20 times. You got to really think about what color you want. Cause at this point it's going to have to bill at this point.
Yeah.
So it's more of like it's a fail safe, because like the point of contracts isn't to it's basically like you sign a contract for a lot of things that it would be nice if in faith, and in reality you probably can in faith trust that most people are genuinely trying to be honest. The thing that's great about a contract is it does help people be honest. It helps them not be tempted to kind of be dishonest. It helps, as Cory was mentioning, it kind of functions to lay out the expectations, which actually will lead to a more satisfied customer, because a customer who realizes, like the beauty of having that conversation up front is then the customer is not going to be surprised when you're saying like, hey, I have to keep a roof over my head. And at this point, like, these revisions are starting to take a lot of, like, you don't have to have that long, uncomfortable conversation, because you've already laid it out that like, hey, my work has value. This is what it costs per hour. So anything that exceeds that, is going to be billed at that.
And Josh,
so there's no surprises, which usually means happier clients.
Yeah. And you mentioned honesty. And I think this is a good point. One of the things that I do as I'm explaining the contract is I give the client the benefit of the doubt, and I tell them, listen, I don't work with dishonest people, and so I wouldn't even be here if I thought you were dishonest, right? But just, so that you're protected and so that I'm protected, that's why this is here. And you would never do this because you're an honest person, but some people might, try to, stiff me on this part or try to get, blah, 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 blah. And so that's why this is here. And I found that like phrasing it that way, where I grant that compliment and that trust, also sets an expectation that I'm extending you trust, and I expect you to deal honestly with me as I deal honestly with you. And that's helpful, because if they are going to be dishonest, they're going to have to confront that conversation in their memory before they're dishonest. And they're going to, what, like, we agreed to be upfront with each other, and he's been upfront with me this whole time. And so I'm not going to try to sneak this by him, because sometimes, and we've all done this, I've done this, you know, in the heat of the moment or in the emotional decision, sometimes you can rationalize a bad choice that kind of screws somebody over. And if you're not thinking about it, it becomes kind of an instinctual to be like self-preservation and whatnot. But if it's called out in the open that like, this is what we consider bad behavior and this is what we consider good behavior, we're all good people here, so we're not going to do bad behavior. Then when you're up against that choice, very few people, they've got to be pretty dang underhanded at that point to be like, I'm going to willfully choose evil. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so usually if you have that conversation up front, again, the contract is a good roadmap to just manage the expectations.
So I also think that that's a great transition, just talking about evil, to kind of bringing up one of the other functions of a contract that's really good, which is if you have a client who's not willing to put in writing and agree to a legally binding agreement that they're going to pay you, chances are if they're arguing about that and they're having trouble with that, we're not talking like, you know, somebody who's smart maybe reads through the contract and is like, you know, we're a company that works this way, so we'd prefer if this verbiage were changed to this or something like that. That's kind of natural. But somebody who's like really like debating what you want to get paid, how much time it's gonna take you,
or trying to talk you out of the contract in general, and just say, "Hey, we don't need a contract. Yeah. Back in my day, we did business on a handshake. Isn't that good enough for you?"
Yeah. Are you trying to say that I'm gonna cheat you and stuff like that? Generally, like you just want to think like, would you go into a car dealership, right? And buy a car and they're like, you know, paperwork, like, do you really need that? Can't you just trust that we're selling you the car? Like, you don't really need the title to the car. Right. It's like, no, you need the title to the car. I don't care how much you like that salesperson. Like, you don't own the car until you have a title. And I would say the same, like, you don't actually have a client until you have a contract.
And also just to let everyone know, if you're not familiar, any artwork you do without a contract, you still own. You have to transfer that right to the client. So if they're against contracts, they don't own that. Whatever you created for them, they don't actually own that unless you sign that right or a particular license to use that artwork over to them.
Yeah, and that's another thing that we should get to is licensing, because that's huge. But I just want to go up
that one part though. Like I said, the thing that's beautiful about the contract before we kind of transition is that you are literally warding off bad actors. Yeah. Because like I said, anybody who's just saying, hey, we don't want to pay you, this will be good exposure, you should have some red flags go up at that point. Because, you know, would you say that to a hairdresser? Like, hey, this will be really good exposure for you. You're a service worker, and to do a service, you should be getting paid unless it's something you're really enjoying or a favor for a friend or something. Yeah. You know, and similarly, like anybody who's frightened off by a contract would be somebody to be really leery of. And I would just cap on that, like in my experience, the only people who've been afraid of contracts tend to be startups. And to be honest, in my experience, it's only been a few times in like close to over 15 years now that I've done professional art. I think it was like maybe 2 or 3 times where I had somebody like just screw me for pay, just completely not pay. And each of those times it's been a startup, not like you would think it would be some mega corporation with a team of lawyers that can really get you. But I'm really suspicious of startups because for some reason, the larger corporations tend to not even want to bother with like the potential trouble it could cause. And so generally they will pay you and fulfill their contracts. And it's not something to go by, but it's just been my experience. Well, anyhow, sorry.
And along those lines, if there is a red flag in the beginning of that relationship, just get out. It's my general rule. Like, it's not going to get better, right? It's like if you're dating somebody, and they punch you in the face when they get angry. Yeah. That behavior is not going to get better when you get married. So you don't enter into a contract with that individual, right? And so if you are having a conversation and they start mentioning exposure and your portfolio and what a great opportunity this is, there are certain words along those lines where it's like, are you trying to grift me? That's kind of like a yellow flag. But then red flag is like, hey man, we don't need a contract. Or, this is what I want to transition into is payment. I don't feel like I should pay you before you do any work. If they're not willing to put some skin in the game at the beginning, no. Those are two major red flags that I politely say, okay, well, these are the rules that I follow, and I appreciate your time. I don't need this job, and so if you'd like to follow the way this works out, then that's great. This is how it's going to go. If they try to talk you out of it, you don't need to have that conversation. Which brings me to one of the most important things to sift out bad actors and good actors, which is money up front. And like Josh said in the beginning, not every industry works this way. Like an example, editorial is way different, right? But when you are a one-to-one, your business and someone else's business, you get money up front. And my rule is, if it's less than $5,000, I get 50% up front. If it's more than $5,000, I get 40% and then 30-30. And so I usually do 2 payments, one of 50, one of 50, or 3 payments, one of 40 and 2 of 30. And you do those on milestones. And so like what Scott was talking about before we went live on this podcast kind of kicked off this whole topic, which is, getting the payment is when you begin the work. And if they're like, and I've had this conversation where they're like, oh, but man, I'm in such a big hurry. It's like, okay, well, speed that check along then, so that I can get started, because I don't expect you to stiff me. I think you're a good person. But I have a rule, and you understand, like, how I've got to follow this because I've been burnt in the past, not by you, and I don't expect you to, but it's just one of those things. And I've literally said this one time. They said, but we really need to get going on this, but it takes our accountants, 2 weeks to get that check cut. And I said, well, call your accountants and get them to cut it earlier. If you're really in a hurry for this rush job and you're paying me this rush fee, then you need to rush. I'm just going to wait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also want to preface that with make sure that you're not saying that with like a storyboarding job, which is going to charge like daily rates,
right?
Or like a specific kind of job. Like you want to research the industry you're doing this in.
Yeah.
But I would say in general, for like, especially a straight up illustration for a kid's book, for like, if you're getting hired to do something substantial, particularly what Cory was mentioning about getting it in thirds, like it'd be kind of ridiculous to get the payment for like a t-shirt design in thirds,
right.
Because it's a single illustration. So half up front, pretty fair, because you're guaranteed to at least walk away with that money, and they're guaranteed to at least walk away with delivery of the first round of artwork. That also, by the way, should be included, just tying into contracts again, include that as, like if you take like 50% off up front as a retainer, that's a retainer that gets forfeited if they don't pay at the end. So that's another thing to kind of assure that you'll get paid for your work, because at that point they're 50% invested. And if you deliver on the brief, like they're going to want to use that art and not be out 50%, And
I will also say this along those lines, Josh, as a general rule. I say these are general rules, but as a general rule, never turn over your source files until you get the final payment. Because once you give high resolution files, you no longer have any leverage, and they just got it for 50% off, right? And I've had that same conversation. Oh, but CK, we're in a huge hurry. Cool, cut me that check, or you can pay me online. It's fine. There's lots of different ways to give me that money. As soon as you get it to me, you'll have those files in minutes. I've got them right here.
So let me tell like one horror story, because I don't have a lot, but there's this one where I did this graphic novel job for a client, and it was like 80 pages or so. And they paid every installment except the very last installment. and they made up an excuse for not paying the last installment. Like they had to do some pitches and stuff with the art that they'd been provided. And in that case, that was one of those scenarios where they had all the files, and it was just literally the last installment. It was such a small amount compared to the whole job that I didn't pursue it too much. But it was like 2 years later, I got an email from that same person saying, "Hey, do you have those source files again? We lost them." And I was like, "Well, that sucks."
It's like, "Hey, do you have that final payment plus 15 years interest?"
Well, that's what I told him. I was like, by contract, like this is how much interest you owe, due to like the failure to pay for this amount of time. And, I'm under no obligation to hold any of those files after they've been delivered. And so I'm never like that with most clients. But in that case, I have to admit it was like a very poetic moment that kind of made it almost worth, in fact, probably was worth the amount that I didn't get. Because spite sometimes is rad. So Squatchy in the chats was mentioning that with tattooing, that's why he's hesitant to kind of quote over the phone, because like what everybody calls 3 inches varies in person. So they might be like, I need a 3-inch tattoo, and then they show what 3 inches is, and it's like a foot. A 3-inch tattoo that's like covering my entire back. I can imagine with tattooing, that's probably a scenario too, where you definitely want to be getting paid. Generally with tattooing, right? It's before the work, I think, is even completed that you're kind of putting it in. And if it's a tattoo that's going to take like a couple sessions, I think they do it in chunks. Correct me if I'm wrong, Squatchy. I'd love to hear how you guys deal with pricing.
But again, because of the different ways that art works in different industries, there are different practices. And so we're kind of speaking generally and mainly about specific types of graphic design and illustration. But definitely talk to other people and figure out. And in some industries, people aren't going to talk to you. And in other industries, people are going to be happy to talk to you because, they're going to remember what it was like to try to figure it out themselves or whatever. But for the most part, most creatives are going to be happy to kind of discuss this and whatever. And it's a really, really interesting thing. Another important part of the contract that I want to talk about is a kill fee, or a cancellation fee. Build into the contract what happens if the client decides to kill it. And I'll tell a story, and I'll use generalities. This is probably one of the bigger jobs I've ever gotten. I sat down with a company, and they had planned this giant job, multiple video, multiple illustration, multiple animation type thing, like big thing. I was gonna have to build a team around it and whatnot. And we settled at $12,000 for the gig, right? And so because of that, I took 3 payments. So I said, all right, let's get going on this. And they were like, yeah, we're really, really excited to do this. And we're in a huge hurry because our salesmen are about to hit the road, and this is really going to help us sell and blah, blah, blah. And I said, great, that's great. And so they had no problem giving me the check. So they gave me the check. And then it was this hurry up and wait. I just was waiting. And I'm like, I need what we agreed to so that I can get started on this. Let's get some shooting dates. Let's get a script going, And they were never negative. It was always like, oh, I'm sorry, it's our fault. We're kind of getting caught up in this loop and everything. And then a year later, I checked in with them 2 or 3 times. And then I just kind of said, well, they'll get back to me when they get back to me. So I didn't touch that money, right? Because in that's bad practice to spend it before, right? And so I kept it in a separate bank account. A year later, they came back to me, hey, I realized that we're outside of the range of the contract. Can we renegotiate? We still want the same thing. And I said, yeah, let's just pick it up where we left off. That's fine. Let's go. I've still got the money, so let's do it. Same situation. They get back into kind of bureaucratic hell of kind of, decision by committee, back and forth a few times with me. At this point in time, I've met with them a dozen times. So there's like 12 hours worth of meeting time that I've put into this project. Then, nothing again for another year. And so year 2 of this, same time they come up, let's do it. Okay. And so I get back into it again. And then and then we started it up and whatever. I meet with him for another 2 or 3 times to get everything going, and then nothing happened. And so I have in the contract a kill fee that says that, if the client decides to kill this project, any money that has been paid, is non-refundable, and the client will also pay whatever percentage of the project has been done. Yes. And so if they pay 30%, but you do 50% of the work, they still owe you 20% of that payment.
Yeah.
And most companies are going to say, you know what, we changed gears. We understand that you put a bunch of work into this. That's fine. Let's square this up and we're good to go. And in that case, I just didn't hear from him again. And so after 2 years, I figured, okay, I'm going to enact that kill fee. And so I just sent him a little note that said, hey, I realize you guys are super busy. I'd love to work with you when you're ready. I'm just going to kind of invoke this kill fee in the contract, just so you guys know I'm going to close this loop. When you're ready, call me up and we'll renegotiate and get another contract started. And there's other times where they just change their mind and they just say, hey, I want something different. Sorry, you're done. We're killing this project. And then you say, okay, great. That's good. Let me just remind you that, if you're going to cancel this project, that I am 65% of the way through. You've signed off on 2 of those milestones, so you're aware of the progress that I've made. We have in writing that you agree that I've done this much, via email and whatnot. So I'll just shoot you an invoice for the remainder of what you owe me. And if you say it like that and you don't say it like you're begging or trying to negotiate, it's just an expected thing. It's way different where you're just like, oh yeah, no problem. I completely understand. Let's see, where are we right now? Oh yeah, you've already paid me 50%. I've done a little bit more than 50%. So I'll bill you for the remainder, and just let me know if you need me in the future.
Yeah. And here's the thing that I want to say, because I know if somebody's new to this whole thing and charging for art, they might be like, oh, this just sounds like a lot. Or even if they start researching the rates you should be charging hourly to come up with your estimates, they might be like, oh, that's a lot of money and I'm a student. I don't need that much, Right. A lot of this stuff, just to kind of take you away from that mindset, because I think that mindset's encouraged by what I've called the Titanic mindset, where it's all artists are just aching for a moment to draw you like one of their French girls kind of things, where art just flows out of you and you do art for fun, right? And I really think there's a devaluing to the industry that's come from this societal idea that what we do is so different from a craft.
Yeah.
And I think if you just kind of approach it from the standpoint of when you're setting up your business, you really want to start almost thinking about it like you're a plumber or you're a contractor, like a housing contractor, because you are a contractor. You're doing labor by contract. And so, just think about this. If somebody comes to your house to fix your pipes or whatever, and you've told them a problem and they've told you their hourly rate, they come in and they give you an estimate of how much time it takes. If you can't afford it, you usually just go, dude, I just can't afford it.
Right.
But rarely are you going to sit down with a plumber and be like, that's really going to take 2 hours to fix. Are you sure it's going to take 2 hours? If you started haggling with a plumber like that, they'd just leave and be like, good luck, get somebody else to fix your pipes,
Yeah. And sometimes I'll do this, especially with mechanics. I'll take, hey Scott, that's near the mic. Whatever's going on.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'll take the mechanic, say, hey, check it over, and they give you this bill if you need to fix everything in your car, it's going to be $3,500. And it's well, it's a $2,000 car. So what I'll ask them is, I never ask them to work for less, but I will say, what's needed? What's actually a necessary fix? An emergency fix. What's something that I need to kind of budget for, and what's just the stuff that would be super nice to have. And every mechanic that I've ever talked to is this gasket is a major problem that is just waiting to kill your engine. This stuff, you should do that in the next 6 months. This stuff is just I wouldn't touch it. It's not worth the money.
Yeah.
And that's a fine thing to do. And that's why I do the ABC thing with people is, hey, I'll draw you everything in the world, if you pay for it, but you probably only need this, you know? And so if they come back and they're like, oh man, I can't afford that. Don't just be like, well, sucks to be you, I'm out, right? Say, hey, I completely understand. I've been thinking about this, and I think what you actually need is this, right? It'd be nice to have this other stuff, but I can give you this for this much. And that might be that might be better in your budget. You are not lowering your price. You are lessening the amount of you're lessening the amount of work you're doing.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and it's a really, really good advice. I think that you can lose clients potentially if somebody comes to you and they say, I want a crowd scene. I want every person in the crowd completely detailed, and I want it in full color, and I want it 11 by 17 and ready for print in full bleed.
Yeah.
And then you look at their budget, and it's like not a budget that is going to pay you what you need hourly to like keep a roof over your head or make it worth your while. And so basically the value that you're going to provide isn't being offered in equal value monetarily. And so what you want to do is, like, instead of turning that person down, you can say, hey, well, here's 3 other ways we could execute like what I think you're trying to do in a more feasible manner that'll fit your budget. Like, maybe instead of full color, maybe we can go to like a 1-tone color or a 2-tone color. So we're doing a minimal palette. You know, we'll still make it really classy. Maybe instead of showing every member of the crowd, maybe we can do some of that in shorthand. Like, maybe we can focus in on a few people in the crowd and then show like the semblance of a crowd in the background. Basically what you're doing is telling somebody with like a very small budget who wants to make an indie film, who says, and then the rocket ships are going to take off in outer space and there's a giant epic space battle. And you're like, yeah, we don't have the budget for CG. So how can we kind of tell that story on a smaller budget?
Maybe
it's
the actors
same thing.
can
It's just
talk
a reality
about,
check
maybe
for
they
a
can
person
talk
with
about the
a
space
limited
battle.
budget.
Sorry.
What?
I said maybe the actors can talk about the space battle.
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
maybe it can be a semblance of a space battle. Maybe
Yeah.
you can cut the CG down so that it you know, it's more of like a shot of the Earth with like a very small spaceship that you don't see a lot of detail on. So it looks high budget, but it's under budget.
Or everybody on the deck lurches when we shake the camera. And then
Exactly.
and then it'll feel like you just can't. Sorry.
I love it though. No, but those are considerations that everyone takes in every creative endeavor. And so at that point, you become kind of an ally of the client finding what they need. If it gets to a point where what they need does not fit what you can afford to do, then, you know, like, and this is something I always keep in the back of my head too, is like, at what point does a project become more annoying? Like, meaning, am I seeing someone else's vision come to life when I could be doing that with my own vision? And then at what point, like, monetarily, does that become pretty much the same thing? I hope that kind of makes sense the way I worded that. Yeah. But to me, I'm like monetarily budgeting it of like, if I'm not doing my own vision, then like second in priority for like low budget would be like, hey, Scott's got this crazy vision and I'm on board with Scott because he's a friend of mine. So maybe I'll take a lower rate because it's Scott and it's his vision. Now, if it's Scott and it's another client's vision, suddenly that's a rung down. Does that make sense? Yeah. But like if I'm literally talking to somebody who's not a friend, not a family member, they're calling me buddy on the phone, that's a really big warning sign. If it's somebody you don't know and they're calling you buddy and pal and hey, man, you know, like, you know, let's just do a deal. It's like, to me, just the hairs stand up a little bit. Right. So I'm like, we're not buddies. Like, this is a business transaction. And it's not bad to be friendly in business, but my point is like, there's a fake friendly that's really good to be leery of when it comes to like pricing and stuff. So anyhow, point being, that was a really long tangent, but the point that I was getting at is just that, you know, if you realize that your art has value and that it's actually work to do, which is something you'll realize one way or another, like you're going to realize it's work when you're drawing the 50th person in that crowd scene I mentioned before, you know, you're going to realize it's work when you're on your 5th revision of that crowd scene because they wanted everybody to have hats and they didn't mention that in the original brief.
Jeez.
These things happen because it's communication, and communication's flawed. And so the contract just protects you and protects you from potential bad actors, but it also protects the client. And the last thing I feel like we didn't mention is that here's the problem with your contract for you as the artist. Number one, it pretty much needs to ensure that you're going to do the job. If you don't do the job that you're being hired to do, you're in trouble by your own contract.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's an essential thing to be in there. The second thing that's a really good restraint on us as creatives is that if you don't hit that deadline, you're in trouble too.
Yeah.
And by your own contract, because art that doesn't hit deadlines is sometimes completely useless to the person who hired it, who paid for it.
Yeah. Like also, I just want to interject real quick. Make sure that deadline is contingent on when you're getting things back from the client, because a client could drag their feet forever for 30 days, and then you got 2 weeks. I mean, and then you got you got 3 days to complete it. And you're supposed to do that in that amount of time. So it's you do it in stages. So
yeah, make sure you don't you can say, like, for instance, if they want to hit a specific date, work out, like Cory and I have talked about this. Scott's talked about this too before, but it's just back planning. So you want to back plan it and kind of have check-in stages each time, because like a contract has to be contingent on mutual steps. And so the point being, like, if the rough stage, the delivery date from rough approval to final approval is contingent on the feedback based on the roughs that you provided. So you want to make sure you work that in the contract. And like, once again, you can say, if feedback is received by this point, then we should be able to hit this deadline. But if feedback, it'll take this long from the point of feedback to the point of delivery.
Yeah.
And then once again, like, you're human beings. So like, most people don't flip out if you got like a fever in the middle of working on a massive project and it might have to be delayed. I think as long as it's communicated, people are usually pretty forgiving.
Yeah.
But yeah, the contract also protects the client from you blowing a deadline if they've hit all their marks, But it also, like Scott very wisely pointed out, you got to build that into the contract so that it also ensures that they will hit their deadlines and what you need for you to do that job. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to talk about licensing, and I think we should save that for another episode, because I'd love to hear Scott's thoughts on that, as well as you, Josh. But we are 90 minutes into this, so should we call it? Okay. So yeah. So any final thoughts, Scott? We talked a lot of anything else that you want to throw in there, kind of as to wrap all this up.
I don't know that you really could wrap it all up. I think we could probably do this. We could do a whole series on this, and we still wouldn't cover everything. So yeah, there's still a lot of stuff, but I don't want to keep dragging on this. I think it might be something we just need to revisit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's do that. Actually, I think that's a really good point. In the comments here, if you're listening to this podcast later, come and find us on CoryKerr.com/48HR and find this video and leave us a comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave us a comment. What are your questions about negotiation? What are your questions about pricing? What are your questions about contracts and that type of thing? And also, I think we will kind of build a little series kind of out of this, maybe not sequentially, but every once in a while when the three of us get together, I think this little brain trust has got enough different angles on the industry that I think that'd be really valuable. So let us know what you would like to know about this type of thing, and I'm sure one of us will have the answer, which will be interesting. So if you want to check out what we're doing, go to CoryKerr.com/48HR. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, it is available wherever podcasts are sold for the price of free. And you can go there and leave a review. Some of you have left a review, which I was going to pull up here, but I don't have it in front of me, so I will do that next time. If you want to check out my work, you can go to corykerr.com, and I've got all kinds of stuff going on there. If you want to check out Josh's work, you can go to quarterlystories.com, which is also available on Tapas, and which is a mobile app where you can read comics and do all kinds of cool things, so check that out. And as always, you can check out Scott Serkland's work at serkworks.com. Brand new site, really good looking stuff. And if you sign up for his email newsletter, you're going to get a lot of really cool assets for making comics. There's this whole pack that he's giving away, and then if you stay subscribed, he'll give away stuff every once in a while as he makes it. And so jump on that. Wait,
Cory, how much is that pack?
That pack is actually free.
Oh,
free for the price of an email. So yeah. So anyway, thanks for jumping in and hanging in there with us. We will I'll check the quality of this feed, and if it's not good, I'll upload the local file I've got. So we'll catch you guys in a couple days.
All right. Bye.